When I was a little girl, I was given a role. I didn't ask for this role. I didn't want this role. And I didn't apply for the role either. But because I was the eldest in my family, I was given the role of chief negotiator at the door. And what that involved was dealing with people who came to our home looking for money, that we owed money to. So you cannot negotiate for your gas or your electricity. They just cut you off straight away. But you can negotiate with the coal man, the paper woman, and the vegetable man. And they were sound. I'd go out to the door, I'd say, "Me ma's not home." Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, pigtails. And I'd say, "Can we pay you next week?" And all of the working class people knew what the story was. They said, "See you next week, Nico. That's grand." The television man was very important to me because he was my access to MTV. So I had to make sure that I negotiated with him correctly. The insurance man, he was professional. He put me through my paces. I had to make sure that I negotiated with him correctly. He wanted a specific day and time to pin me down when he knew my mum was going to be home, but my mum was in the living room, okay? The most hurtful person who used to come to the door was the cable man, because he used to just not give you any notice and cut the cable off from the front of the house, in front of the neighbours. But what he didn't know is that I was brazen enough to walk down the road 5 minutes later to ask for a lend of a ladder and plug it back in myself. So I still had access to MTV. I was doing okay. And this might all sound really funny, and it's gas to relay those stories now, but there was a sinister side to what was going on at the time. I was being taught to lie. I was being taught to be a people pleaser. I was being taught to put a false self forward at the door. I was being taught that I had to put this mask on and be an all-singing, all-dancing people pleaser at the front door. And it takes a long time to unravel all of that shame. But it wasn't all negative. I always try and draw on the positives. The positives from those situations were that I was fine-tuning and honing in on my communication skills. I knew how to hold a conversation. I knew how to make good eye contact. I knew how to give a good handshake. And that all really stood to me as I got older. I also knew that the filled violence and narcissism that I was exposed to when I was growing up was not going to be part of my future. I felt like everything was out of my control at the time, and I really, really wished my life away. Every single day as a child felt like a week. Every week felt like a month, and every month felt like a year. And I wished my life away. I thought that my childhood was the longest childhood in history, and I just couldn't wait to be an adult so that I could make the changes and be in control. My school days were very difficult. I tried very, very hard. I studied really hard, but I just couldn't perform in exams, and I certainly couldn't remember me 10 times tables or me spellings. And I put myself down as dyslexic, and I slipped through the cracks of education. And I was left unattended and unassessed for my whole time in school. And it was only when I became an adult in my 30s that I decided proactively to be tested. And at the end, the psychologist said to me, "Nicola, I've great news for you. You're not dyslexic." I was devastated. Devastated. It was the worst news he could have ever given me. And I said, "Well, what's the story then? What am I?" And he said, "Nicola, you are suffering from PTSD. So PTSD mimics dyslexia, and it kind of feels and looks the same, but it's very, very different." My one biggest outlet was my community, playing camogie, my beloved sport. being part of St. Monica's Youth Centre. The one thing that I excelled in was running. And I used to love Mr. Daly's face every single time I took home a gold. He was proud, he empowered me, he encouraged me. He showed me what community meant. Come unity, come together in unity. And he gave me a sense of the fact that I knew he was proud of me, and that just made me want to work so much harder for him and for the community. So I'm very lucky where I came from, because I had all of that surrounded me. It surrounded me every single day. So after a couple of really not nice incidences in my early teenage years, I decided I was going to ask a professional body for help. I didn't feel like I could reach out to my family for the shame and the embarrassment, and there was just stories that we didn't talk about. So I got my story straight. I knew what I was going to say. I practiced my lines on the way down the street. I went into this office. I had to take a number. I was very nervous. I sat down. I was surrounded by adults. I was the only child in the room. And I watched everybody filtering off into this room to speak to this man. When my number was called, I ran over to the door and I was stopped. And they asked me to wait because they needed a woman to be present. So a woman went into the room, and when I went in, there was a man and a woman behind the desk. And I told them my story. It was the first time that I told my story, and it was the first time that I asked for help. And I thought I was deadly. I told the story very well, and I told it in granular detail. So afterwards, I sit back and I say, so what's the plan? Because I'm a very action-orientated person. I said, what's the plan? What are we going to do? And they both looked at each other. And the guy laughed up into my face and said, go home to your ma, love, will you? And that was the last time I asked for help. Shortly after this, my mum decided to empower herself, my brother and I find myself standing in Dolphin House, the family law court in Dublin. I was prepared. I was 17, double-breasted navy pinstripe suit, block high heels, my files, very meticulously prepared. I rock up to the judge. We're called. I rock up to the judge. My mum is standing beside me. He starts asking me questions. I'm answering the questions very articulately because I was deadly. And then he says, Miss Connolly, your client is running out the door. And I turned and I looked over my shoulder and I saw my mum running away. And I said, Judge, that's not my client. That's my mum. Give me a minute. I'll go get her and we'll sort all this out. And he leaned over and said, tell your mother not to waste this court's time again. There are people in this place who actually want help. And he took his hammer and he slammed that hammer down on that desk. And with the noise of that hammer, it sealed my fate for the next number of years. I fell in with a crowd that were not very good for me, and I find myself in a position being sexually abused by a man that I loved. Not only did he sexually abuse me, at one time he sexually abused me in front of somebody else. And I am still dealing with the shame and the embarrassment that that brings me. And with all abusers, it doesn't get better, it just gets worse. And I find myself one weekend, a very, very long weekend, the longest weekend of my life, where I was stripped of all of my clothes and my shoes and my belongings, and I was held hostage for 4 days and 3 nights. On the 4th day, I couldn't take another moment of this, so I decided to take my own life. And thankfully, it didn't work. Shortly after that, I divulged the suicide part, not the sexual abuse part, to a man that I loved. And he should have loved me back. He was very, very important in my life. And when I shared this information with him, I said to him, I tried to take my own life. his response to me was, "It's a pity it didn't work." And that was very difficult for me to accept. But what I've learned since then is that you can't give away what you don't own. He didn't love himself, so he couldn't love me. I went down a rabbit hole. I spiraled out of control. I abused drugs. I abused alcohol. And one day, a number of years later, I woke up in a place that was very dangerous. And I got the fright of my life. And I promised myself from that moment forward, I would never, ever touch drugs again. Because I was trying to numb the pain of my own reality. That's the only reason why I was doing drugs. Now, I'm partial still to a glass of wine. I haven't given that up. So I find myself not being able to sleep, not being able to eat properly, not being able to concentrate. And I go to my doctor and I explain the situation. And at 17 years old, he diagnoses me with depression. He issues a prescription for medication and he suggests that I go and seek a counsellor. There was one very important question that should have been asked in the room that day, and that was, why are you feeling like this? He didn't take the time to get to the root of the cause of the problem. So I danced the merry dance for many years with lots and lots of counsellors. And I have had more counsellors than I own brass. I'm not saying all counsellors are like this, but what I am saying is all of the ones I had were shite. I was in a room one day. I decided I was going to spend a lot of money. I said, if I just spend more money on counsellors, maybe I'll get a good one. So I find myself in a very, very beautiful room. And there's a girl sitting miles away from me in a beautiful Queen Anne chair. And I'm sitting in a very similar chair. And on session 3, I realised this one hasn't opened her mouth. And I said, listen, chicken, have you any guidance around in here? Do you have any info you're going to pass on here, the knowledge-wise And she says, Nicola, I'm providing a space for you to speak and share your story. And I say, listen here, I've loads of spaces. I've loads of rooms. I've loads of walls I can talk to. And that was the last I saw her. So I decided I was going to be my own hero and I was going to empower myself. So I went back to what I did when I was a child and I went back to the writing. And I've written myself out of every horrible situation I've ever been in. I carved out a wonderful career for myself. I've had a wonderful, very varied career. I married my childhood sweetheart. Marriage is very difficult. The start was a bit shaky, but we got there in the end, okay? We have 2 beautiful children who I absolutely adore, and I love spending time with them. We have forged out a beautiful lifestyle for ourselves. And when 2 broken people get married together, it's very challenging, but we've managed to work it out, and we're absolutely flying at this marriage gig now at the minute. Well, we should be. We're nearly 19 years in. So I did empower myself and I did make all of the changes and I do have a beautiful life. And it's really, really important that this is the part of the story that you listen to and you forget the rest because the rest is not important. This bit is important. The rest of the stuff is salacious, but this is the important bit where the lessons come. If you want to be the tall poppy in your own life, I want you to accept that other people sometimes are not going to be happy about that. Some people are going to swipe for a pound of flesh. Some people are going to try and cut the legs from underneath you, and that's okay. Some of these people might be your friends, they might be your family, they might be your neighbours. You might be related to them, and that's okay. I have designed a theory for life. And if you work on the following areas, I promise you, you will be successful. And when I say successful, I do not mean in the material sense. I mean in the peace sense. Peace in your life, peace in your heart, peace in your soul, peace in your mind. You need to get check of your ego. And when I say ego, I don't mean braggadocious ego. What I mean is The negative self-talk of, you can't do that because of your socioeconomic background, Nicola. Don't apply for that job. Don't say that thing. Don't put your hand up. That's a part of ego that we need to address ASAP. The next important part are your values. You have to live your values daily on display. You have to be able to give out your values, and what's very important, and everybody forgets this bit, you have to be willing to receive your values from other people in equal measure. Now, I'm very partial to a boundary. You have to get your boundaries in check. You have to be willing to protect your boundaries at all costs. You also have to work on your relationship with yourself and other people, okay? Because if you hold on to being a survivor of anything, you will never be a thriver, and that's a choice. I'm a thriver. If you choose to suffer from PTSD or suffer from anything else, you'll be suffering forever. When you suffer from something, it owns you. But I experience things and I learn things from everything that I go through. So I experience stuff and I own it. And if you're holding on to being a victim and your story, you will be a victim for the rest of your life. And I choose to be a victor. And I want you to choose to be a victor too. So now it's your turn for you to be your own hero and for you to show me how you can be the change. Thank you.